The person who got the top score probably didn't travel the farthest to get it, and we just handed the prize to the wrong thing.
I mean, it's a fundamental miscalculation that we make like every single day. We're so obsessively looking at the finish line that we're completely blind to where the starting line actually was.
Right.
And because of that, we are grading human potential at the exact wrong moment. And, we're using the entirely wrong ruler to do it.
It completely flips how you think about success, to be honest. So welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. The core mission we are tearing into today, based on Adam Grant's hidden potential, is this idea that talent isn't a starting gift.
Right. It's not just this biological lottery ticket.
Exactly. Talent is a distance traveled, what looks like a natural, innate gift. That undeniable spark we all love to romanticize it's almost always the result of hidden scaffolding and deeply ingrained character skills.
Yeah, it's those unseen elements that turn ordinary raw material into incredible achievement. And this is the lens through which you really need to view every workplace promotion, every college admission, and honestly, every judgment you make about yourself.
Totally.
We suffer from this massive systemic measurement error. We confuse a high starting point with high potential.
And we are going to unpack exactly how to fix that ruler today. Because the phrase we were going to keep coming back to, the mantra for this whole deep dive, is that we have to measure the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.
The distance traveled, not the height of the peak. It really changes everything once you see it.
It really does. So I was reading through the case studies on this, and there is this one moment that perfectly captures this whole illusion. It's the spring of 1991.
Go.
The National Junior High Chess Championships, just outside of Detroit. Picture this massive convention hall. It is packed to the brim with middle schoolers. But the second the clocks start, the entire room goes dead silent.
I can literally feel the tension.
Right. The only sound is the frantic click, click, click of the chess pieces hitting the boards. Now, if you scan the room, the contrast is just unbelievable. On one side, you have the defending champions, the kids from the Dalton School in New York City.
Which is like an incredibly elite prep school.
Exactly. They basically built an Olympic training center for chess. These kids have had mandatory chess classes since kindergarten. They have private grandmaster tutors. I mean, their parents fly them to international tournaments.
So they are the absolute epitome of early advantage. The system was designed to optimize their performance from the moment they could, hold a pawn.
Yeah, exactly. But then, across the board from them, you have a team called the Raging Rooks. They are this scrappy, totally underfunded group of 8th and 9th graders from Junior High School 43, a public school in Harlem.
Wow, okay.
They barely had the budget to field a team, let alone travel to Detroit. They obviously didn't have a decade of private coaching. In fact, some of them only learned how the pieces moved a couple of years prior. Their team captain, Kassan Henry, literally learned to play chess in a local park by watching a drug dealer play.
That is just, the environmental contrast is staggering. You have a frictionless track on one side and this massive mountain of structural barriers on the other.
And yet, defying every single statistical expectation in that room, the Rooks tied for first place.
Ugh, amazing.
They went toe-to-toe with Dalton's top players and tied for the national championship. Now, if you just look at the final score, they are equals. They both hold the exact same trophy. But if you look at the climb, the Rooks covered 10 times the ground.
And this is exactly what we mean when we talk about the measurement error. When we evaluate potential in society, we make the cardinal mistake of focusing exclusively on visible abilities on day one. We look at the y-intercept on a graph.
Right, the starting point.
Yeah. The Dalton kids started halfway up the mountain. Their y-intercept was incredibly high. The Raging Rooks started down in the valley. But if you only judge people by what they can do on the first day of the assessment, their actual potential, like the steepness of their slope, remains completely hidden.
It's the difference between trajectory and starting position.
Precisely. The late bloomer who climbed a mountain always beats the prodigy who started halfway up, because the late bloomer actually had to develop the mechanics of climbing. We assume the people with the most promise are the ones who stand out right away, but early performance is a terrible predictor of long-term success.
That actually makes me think of Maya Shankar. Her story is a perfect parallel to this. If you look at her early life, she was the absolute definition of an early peaker.
Oh, yeah, the violin prodigy.
Yeah, she was accepted into Juilliard as a kid, studying under Itzhak Perlman. She was on this completely frictionless track to becoming one of the greatest concert violinists in the world. But then as a teenager, she tore a tendon in her hand.
Devastating.
In a single moment, her entire musical career was permanently over. her starting advantage was totally wiped out.
And that is exactly where you see what her potential actually was, because she didn't just have a high starting point in music, she had developed an astonishing capacity for trajectory.
Right. She completely pivoted. She took all that relentless discipline, the ability to process microscopic feedback, the resilience she learned from the violin, and she applied it to a totally blank slate. Cognitive science.
Which is so far removed from playing the violin.
Exactly. She started from zero in a new field, ended up getting her PhD from Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, and eventually became a senior advisor in the White House, founding the first behavioral science team for the federal government.
What Ma Shankar's life proves is that the specific domain, the violin, wasn't her actual talent. Her talent was her capacity to learn. She knew how to travel the distance.
Okay, but I have to push back here for a second.
Sure, go for it.
Because while Maya Shankar's pivot is incredible, and the Raging Rooks are this phenomenal underdog story, aren't we kind of ignoring the fact that genetic freaks of nature absolutely exist?
What do you mean?
I mean, what about the kids who just fall out of the sky with a 160 IQ? What about Mozart? Everyone uses him as the ultimate example of the innate born child prodigy. If I'm hiring or building a team, shouldn't I still want the Mozart?
It's a completely natural assumption to make, but the historical reality of these so-called prodigies actually proves the exact opposite point.
Really?
Yeah, we love to romanticize Mozart as this divine vessel of music who just scribbled masterpieces as a toddler. But if you read the letters and the historical accounts of his actual life, his father, Leopold Mozart, was a tyrannical music teacher.
Like a stage parent on steroids.
Worse, he essentially forced Wolfgang into what one biographer literally called unconditional slavery. It was rigorous, brutal, nonstop drilling from the time the boy was a toddler. Mozart was writing letters as a teenager talking about how his fingers physically ached, how utterly exhausted he was.
So he wasn't just struck by lightning.
Not at all. He wasn't a freak of nature. He was a freak of nurture. He succeeded in spite of this compulsive, fanatical practice, not because it was some healthy realization of innate genius. And, this isn't just an anecdote. Psychologists once did a landmark study looking at 120 world-class high achievers.
Oh, I saw this in the book. It's fascinating.
Right. We are talking Guggenheim-winning sculptors, internationally acclaimed concert pianists, prize-winning mathematicians, Olympic swimmers, world-class neurology researchers, the absolute best of the best. They interviewed them, their parents, their coaches, and the stunning discovery was that almost none of them were child prodigies.
None. That is the data point that just completely disrupts the narrative.
Literally almost none. Not a single one of the world-class sculptors was identified by their elementary school art teachers as having special abilities. Hardly any of the Olympic swimmers set records early on. Most of the elite tennis players lost in the early rounds of their first tournaments.
So they didn't stand out for unusual aptitude at all.
No. What they stood out for was unusual motivation.
Which usually came from a teacher or a coach early on who just made the learning process fun rather than grueling, right?
Exactly. The whole obsession with early innate talent is a myth.
It reminds me of the Polgar sisters. That famous experiment from the 1960s where the Hungarian psychologist Laszlo Polgar literally published a book titled Bring Up Genius before he even had children.
That's such a wild story.
He publicly declared that any healthy child could be turned into a prodigy with the right environment. He and his wife had 3 daughters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith, and they decided to use chess as the testing ground.
It is honestly one of the most audacious psychological experiments in history. He believed geniuses are made, not born, and he basically proved it.
Yeah. All 3 girls became world-class chess players. Susan became a grandmaster. Sophia achieved the title of international master. And Judith became the greatest female chess player in history, breaking Bobby Fischer's record to become the youngest grandmaster at the time.
And they weren't born with a special chess gene. They were placed in an environment that heavily scaffolded their trajectory. They measured the distance traveled, not the height of the peak. They proved that the ceiling we assume for a person, or, the ceiling we assume for ourselves, is really just a floor that we quietly accepted.
And that leads us to the next really important question. If raw, innate cognitive power isn't the engine that drives a person across that distance, what is?
Right. To figure that out, we have to look at the data. And there is a massive study that isolates exactly what this engine is. Let's go to a kindergarten classroom in Tennessee in the late 1980s.
Right, setting the scene.
The state government decides to run this massive randomized controlled trial called the STAR Project. They randomly assign over 11,000 kindergartners to different teachers. Because it's randomized, they eliminate the variables of wealthy neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods. It is a pure test of a teacher's impact.
Which is so rare to get in educational data.
Exactly. Fast forward a couple of decades. These exact kids are now 25 years old. This brilliant economist at Harvard, Raj Chetty, gets access to the data. He cross-references their kindergarten records with their adult W-2 tax returns, college attendance records, all of it. And he discovers something unbelievable.
What did he find?
Having an experienced above-average kindergarten teacher added over $320,000 in lifetime income to a single class of 20 students.
Wow. Let the weight of that sink in for a second.
Yeah.
The specific human being who taught you how to sit in a circle and eat paste when you were 5 years old is measurably impacting your W-2 tax return 2 decades later.
But the mechanism here is what's fascinating, because your first thought is probably, oh, well, those experienced teachers must have just drilled early math and reading into those 5-year-olds so well that it gave them a massive cognitive head start.
Right, that they learned their ABCs faster.
But that wasn't it. Chetty's team looked at the early standardized test scores. And yes, the kids with the experienced teachers had a temporary bump in math and reading in first and second grade. But by middle school, that cognitive advantage had completely faded. The other kids caught up. Their test scores leveled out.
So if the math and reading advantage disappeared, what actually lasted 20 years?
It was what psychologists call character skills. The researchers looked at the evaluations from when these kids were in 4th and 8th grade. The teachers had rated them on specific behaviors: proactivity, pro-social behavior, discipline, and determination.
And how did the kids with the experienced kindergarten teachers do on those?
They consistently scored significantly higher on these character skills years later. And when Raj Chetty's team ran the regression analysis to predict adult income, these character ratings mattered 2.4 times more than standardized math and reading scores.
2.4 times more. We spend our entire lives obsessing over SAT scores, reading levels, and IQ tests. And it turns out the ability to collaborate, to regulate your emotions, to take initiative, that is the actual operating system.
Yep, the math and reading are just the apps.
It completely breaks the traditional model of academic success. And, we often dismiss these traits as soft skills, which is a historically terrible term.
Oh, I totally agree. It's a completely misleading label.
I despise the term soft skills. It makes them sound like a fluffy throw pillow on a couch. It sounds optional.
The origin of the term is actually from the U.S. military in the late 1960s. They were trying to categorize training. Hard skills were working with metal-like operating tanks, repairing weapons. Soft skills were leadership, communication, and teamwork.
Interesting.
And the military actually recommended dropping the term almost immediately because it made these vital, mission-critical skills sound weak and feminine to the soldiers. But the corporate world adopted it, and it just stuck.
Of course they did.
But today, as AI and machines automate more and more cognitive tasks like coding software, diagnosing diseases, or analyzing legal documents, these character skills are literally the only things that elevate us above the machines.
And what's incredibly empowering is that we have hard data showing these character skills are highly trainable, even in adulthood.
Yes, the West Africa study.
Right. There was this recent fascinating study conducted in West Africa with 1,500 entrepreneurs. These are people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s running local startups. The researchers split them into 2 groups. The first group gets traditional cognitive training, finance, accounting, marketing, the standard MBA curriculum.
Right.
The second group gets character training. They don't look at a single spreadsheet. Instead, they study personal initiative, proactivity, and discipline. They literally role-play how to anticipate problems and overcome setbacks.
And the results of that study were just staggering. Over the next 2 years, the group that received the character training saw their profits soar by 30%.
30%.
That was nearly triple the benefit of the cognitive training group.
Triple the profit just from learning proactivity. But how does that actually work mechanically?
Well, because finance knowledge only helps you react to opportunities that already exist. If a client comes to you, you know how to bill them. But character training taught them how to generate opportunities. It taught them resourcefulness. When the supply chain broke down, the cognitive group waited for it to be fixed. The character group proactively found a workaround.
Okay, but I have to interject here because this clashes with classical psychology.
How so?
William James, the founding father of American psychology. He famously declared that by age 30, a person's character has set like plaster and will never soften again. If I'm 45 years old, how can I just sit in a classroom for a week and learn character? Isn't my personality pretty much locked into my neural pathways?
This is a very common confusion, and it's vital we untangle it. We constantly conflate personality with character. They are entirely different psychological mechanisms. Yes, personality is your predisposition. It's your basic instinct, your default setting on a typical low-stress day. Character is your capacity to prioritize your values over your instincts.
Oh, that is a profound distinction. Let's unpack that a bit more.
Think of it this way. Personality is your tendency, but character is your destiny. If you are naturally a shy, conflict-avoidant introvert, that's your personality. It's how your nervous system prefers to operate.
Right.
But if you witness a blatant injustice at work and your heart is pounding, but you find the courage to stand up and speak out anyway, that is your character overriding your personality. Character isn't how you behave when things are easy. Character is how you show up on a hard day.
So personality might set like plaster, but character is a muscle you can flex.
Exactly. And the beautiful thing the West Africa study proves is that William James was wrong about character. It does not set like plaster. It retains its plasticity forever. You can learn these skills at any age because they are habitual choices, not genetic mandates.
Character is the fuel that allows you to cover the distance traveled, not just rely on the height of your peak. It's not about what you were born with. It's about the habits you build to get better at getting better, which naturally leads us to the mechanics of how we actually build those skills.
Yes, because to travel those great distances, you have to fundamentally change your relationship with friction. You have to develop the courage to deliberately become a creature of discomfort.
I love this concept.
Yeah.
Let's look at a moment in the 1960s.
Oh, the comedy club scene.
Yes. We are inside a dark, smoky comedy club in Los Angeles. Up on stage is a very young Steve Martin. He's got his banjo, he's trying out his act, and he is bombing hard.
It's just painful.
He goes 5 minutes without a single chuckle, 10 minutes of dead silence, 20 straight minutes of agonizing quiet. It gets so painfully bad that a heckler actually stands up, walks toward the stage, and throws a glass of red wine at him.
Ouch.
A critic who saw him during this era later wrote that Steve Martin was the most serious booking error in the history of Los Angeles.
It is physically agonizing just to picture the cognitive load of standing on that stage.
Right. Now, at the time, Steve Martin was trying to learn comedy the way that felt most comfortable to his personality. He was watching others, listening, and doing off-the-cuff improv. Improv felt natural to him. It flowed.
Right.
But to actually get better, to stop getting wine thrown at him, he realized he had to abandon his comfortable improv and embrace the one specific mode of learning he hated most in the world, writing.
Which he despised.
He absolutely hated writing. It was excruciatingly hard for him. He actually had such severe writer's block one night that he had to call his roommate to borrow a joke just to finish a set.
But the neuroscience of what happened next is fascinating. By forcing himself into the unbearable, highly frictional awkwardness of writing, he built entirely new neural pathways.
Also,
He learned to trim the fat from his comedy. Improv allowed his brain to ramble lazily, but a blank piece of paper forced rigid structure. He learned the exact bare-bones architecture of a punchline. He intentionally sought out the mode of learning that was most neurologically uncomfortable for him, and that targeted discomfort is what propelled him to become one of the biggest, most disciplined comedians in American history.
so the takeaway here is that we need to completely throw out the myth of learning styles.
Absolutely. The idea of learning styles, the theory that you are exclusively a visual learner or an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner, is one of the most pervasive, damaging myths in modern education.
Which is crazy because everyone believes it.
Everyone. But when cognitive scientists reviewed decades of rigorous research, they found zero credible evidence that matching instruction to a student's self-reported preferred learning style improves their test scores or retention.
Zero. That is wild to hear because almost every adult I know introduces themselves that way. Oh, I have to draw a map. I'm a visual learner, or I prefer audio because I'm an auditory learner.
What they are describing is a preference, not a biological mandate. What makes you comfortable isn't necessarily how you learn best. In fact, if you only play to your strengths and stick to your preferred style, you completely deprive your brain of the friction required for neuroplasticity.
So comfort is actually the enemy of learning.
Exactly. To grow myelin, which is the insulation around your neural circuits that makes skills automatic, you need productive struggle. If you want to accelerate your learning, you must deliberately seek the awkward, error-filled zone. You have to become a creature of discomfort.
A brilliant modern example of this is Benny Lewis. Benny is a famous polyglot. He speaks over a dozen languages, but he did not start out with a language gene.
Definitely not.
In fact, he took Irish and German in school for years and retained absolutely nothing. He moved to Spain for 6 months after college, lived there, and still couldn't string a basic Spanish sentence together. He genuinely believed he just lacked the biological hardware for languages.
Which is another massive limiting myth.
Right. So finally, he realizes that reading textbooks and quietly making flashcards in his room, which felt comfortable and safe, just wasn't working. He decides to completely invert his method. He creates a strategy he calls social skydiving.
I love that term.
He goes out into the street and starts speaking the new language from day one. He literally wears a bright green leprechaun hat on the streets of foreign cities just to look ridiculous so strangers will approach him. And here's the key. He aims to make at least 200 mistakes a day.
That's his actual goal.
Yes. He explicitly measures his daily progress, not by what he got right, but by how many errors he made.
He deliberately amplified the discomfort. Most people operate under the illusion that learning is about acquiring theoretical knowledge in private until you feel comfortable enough to practice in public.
Right, like we have to be ready first.
Exactly. But Benny's neurobiology proves that learning is about experiencing the visceral discomfort of practice first, which forces the brain to adapt, which leads to progress, which eventually leads to comfort. You don't get comfortable before you practice. Your comfort grows as you practice.
Okay, but hold on. If I'm listening to this, my internal alarm bells are ringing. Deliberately feeling awful, aiming to fail 200 times a day, looking like an absolute fool in a leprechaun hat in public.
Yeah.
Doesn't that just violently crush your self-esteem?
It sounds like it would, yeah.
I feel like my brain's amygdala would just hijack my nervous system, trigger the fight or flight response, and pull the emergency brake.
Yeah.
How do you not just quit?
It's a vital question, and it comes down to how we cognitively frame the feeling of failure. There was an incredible study done with students learning improv comedy, which is notoriously terrifying for beginners.
Right.
The researchers randomly assigned different explicit goals to the students. The group that ended up persisting the longest, the group that took the most creative risks, wasn't the group that was told to focus on learning and growing.
Really? I would have totally guessed it was that group.
No. It was the group that was explicitly told, your goal today is to feel awkward and uncomfortable. If you feel embarrassed, it is a sign the exercise is working.
Oh, wow. So they completely rebranded the pain.
Precisely. When discomfort is unconsciously framed as a warning sign, your amygdala assumes you are in danger and you retreat. But when you are explicitly told by an authority figure that discomfort is the actual signal of progress, your prefrontal cortex overrides the fear.
You lean into it.
You stop running away from the awkwardness and start stumbling toward it. Benny Lewis wasn't crushing his self-esteem because every time someone looked at him like he was crazy, it was a check mark on his goal of 200 daily mistakes. He hacked his own reward system.
That completely shifts the paradigm of how we approach new skills. You can't just sit comfortably on your starting block, reading the manual, waiting for the magical feeling of being ready. You have to get into the arena and actively endure the friction.
Because that friction is the slope. It is the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.
And as you are stumbling forward, deliberately making those 200 mistakes, you have to know how to process the reactions of the people around you. You have to know how to absorb the world. Which brings us to the next critical character skill, being a sponge.
Yes, the sponge mechanism.
Let's trace the life of Melody Hobson to understand this. We are in Chicago. A young girl named Melody comes home from elementary school, and once again, she flips the light switch, and nothing happens.
The electricity is off again.
Cut off. Her single mother is deeply struggling financially. They face evictions. Their car gets repossessed. In first grade, Melody is placed in remedial reading. She is starting from far, far behind the starting line. But in second grade, something clicks.
What happens?
She wins a copy of the book Charlotte's Web in a school contest. She becomes completely obsessed. She relentlessly learns every single word she doesn't know.
She transitions from a passive participant in her environment to an active absorber. She begins to literally soak up the world around her.
Exactly. Fast forward to when she is a teenager. She starts spending her Saturday mornings sitting in a local McDonald's with John Rogers, who is the founder of a major investment firm.
Quite the networking spot.
Right. But she doesn't just listen to him. She sits there aggressively soaking up everything he reads in the newspaper, asking relentless questions about the stock market, absorbing his worldview. Today, Melody Hobson is the co-CEO of Ariel Investments. She's the chair of the board at Starbucks and was named one of Time's 100 most influential people. She became a literal, insatiable human sponge.
What is so crucial to understand here is that being a sponge is a highly proactive character skill.
Yeah.
It's not just about passively taking in information. It's about absorbing the right information to fuel your growth, rather than feeding your ego.
I love the analogy the author uses here. It's the difference between being Teflon, being clay, and being a sponge.
Oh, that's a great framework.
If you are Teflon, you are entirely ego-driven and reactive. Nothing sticks to you. Constructive criticism just slides right off because your defenses are too high.
Right.
If you are clay, you are growth-oriented. But you are completely passive. You just sit there and wait for someone else, a mentor, a boss, to mold you. But a sponge is proactive and growth-oriented. A sponge actively seeks out the water it needs to expand.
And the most important mechanism of being a sponge is how you seek out that water. You don't just wait for a performance review. You actively hunt for input. But you have to know exactly what words to use when you ask for it.
This was my absolute favorite paradigm shift in the entire deep dive. I have to share the personal story the author tells about this because it is so viscerally relatable.
Please do.
Early in his career, he is asked to guest lecture to a room full of seasoned Air Force colonels. He is terrified. He is naturally a shy introvert. He is sweating through his button-down shirt. His voice is shaking. To try and improve for the future, he hands out anonymous feedback forms at the end.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. The colonels absolutely crucify him. One piece of feedback literally said, "Your nervous breathing sounds like Darth Vader." Another wrote, "I gained nothing from this session, but I trust the instructor gained useful insight."
Brutal. Just pure demoralization by useless criticism. We have all experienced that kind of feedback loop.
But the revelation here is that asking for feedback is actually a psychological trap. Feedback inherently focuses the reviewer's brain on how well you did in the past.
Right, it looks backward.
And when people focus on the past, they naturally turn into one of two things. They either become harsh critics who attack your worst self, or they become toxic cheerleaders who just blindly celebrate you to protect your feelings. Neither is useful for growth.
So what is the linguistic hack? Instead of asking for feedback, you must ask for advice.
Advice.
You don't ask, how did I do? You ask, what is one specific thing I can do better next time? It instantly shifts the reviewer's cognitive attention from your past failures to your future potential. It neutralizes their critical instinct and turns them into a coach.
Okay, but I have to play the skeptic here again.
Always a good idea.
Because if I am adopting this sponge identity, and I'm actively soliciting advice from everyone around me, my boss, my peers, anonymous internet commenters, aren't I just going to absorb a massive amount of toxic, useless, biased critique?
That's a valid concern.
If a sponge soaks up dirty water, it just becomes a dirty sponge. How do I not internalize terrible advice?
That is a brilliant counter-argument, and it is exactly why highly effective sponges are not unthinking vacuums. They possess a rigorous internal filtration system. You must deliberately decide which coaches are actually allowed into your psychological inner circle.
And how do we do that?
The research points to 3 specific critical metrics for filtering advice. First, care. Does this person actually want what is best for you? Do they have your long-term well-being in mind? If they don't genuinely care about you, you can completely dismiss their reaction. Their critique is about their ego, not your growth.
Okay, care. That eliminates all the anonymous internet trolls immediately.
Exactly. Second, credibility. Do they have relevant, proven expertise in this specific domain? Your mother might care about you deeply, but if she doesn't know anything about software engineering, her advice on your code is useless.
Makes sense.
And third, familiarity. Do they know you? And do they know your baseline well enough to actually judge your trajectory? If someone hits all 3, care, credibility, and familiarity, that is the advice you aggressively mine for gold. You soak up the right advice to sustain your momentum across the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.
But what happens when you soak up all that brilliant advice, you apply it, and you realize your work still isn't flawless? That brings us to a massive psychological roadblock. I was reading the section on perfectionism, and my brain instantly snapped back to a vivid memory of being 14 years old.
What happened?
Picture a local municipal swimming pool. I am standing on the very edge of a high diving board. The coach is watching from the deck. A line of shivering kids is waiting behind me. And for 45 excruciating minutes, I stood there, completely frozen, without attempting a single dive.
45 minutes.
Yes. Why? Because in my head, I felt my center of gravity was leaning too far forward, or my breathing rhythm was off, or my toes weren't perfectly pointed. My absolute obsession with executing a flawless 10 resulted in absolutely zero progress. I just stood there, paralyzed by the gap between my reality and perfection.
What you experienced on that diving board is the defining trap of perfectionism. Perfectionism is not a commitment to excellence. It is a cognitive distortion. Perfectionists get severe tunnel vision. They obsess over polishing the wrong things, like a tiny splash on a dive or the font on a presentation, while completely ignoring the larger structural flaws, like their vertical leap or the actual core argument of their presentation. The cognitive load of trying to be flawless drains the energy needed to be effective.
It really does. You spend 90% of your energy on the last 10% of the polish.
To combat this, we need to look at Japanese philosophy, specifically the practice of wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi is the discipline of finding beauty and utility in imperfection. It is the active, conscious practice of shifting your attention from an impossible theoretical ideal to an achievable optimal standard.
A perfect example of this is the legendary Japanese architect Tadao Ando. If you look at his work, like the Church of the Light, he is an absolute master of wabi-sabi.
His buildings are incredible.
When he designs his concrete buildings, he relentlessly prioritizes durability and visual design. But he intentionally compromises on pure function and comfort. He knows that to be ruthlessly disciplined in structural integrity, he has to let other aspects go. He knows exactly which flaws do not matter.
Right. He finds the exact sweet spot where good enough is mathematically optimal. And this philosophy runs completely counter to the default platitude we are all taught in school and by our parents. We are constantly told, just do your best.
Right.
But the empirical data shows that doing your best is actually terrible advice for performance. Yeah. Across hundreds of psychological experiments, people who are told to do their best consistently perform worse and learn less than people who are given a specific, difficult target.
That blew my mind when I read it.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. If my diving coach says, just do your best, my 14-year-old perfectionist brain translates best into flawless. The anxiety skyrockets.
Exactly.
But if the coach says, I want you to aim for a 6.5 on this dive, suddenly the paralyzing pressure for a 10 is gone. A 6.5 allows for bent knees and a splash. You have a specific achievable standard that allows you to jump.
Which gets you off the board and actually learning.
Okay, but I have to challenge this broadly. I completely get wabi-sabi for a diving board or an architect balancing aesthetics. But if I am on an operating table, I want a perfectionist heart surgeon.
Naturally.
If I am boarding a Boeing 747, I want a perfectionist aerospace engineer. I don't want a pilot who practices wabi-sabi and says, hey, the landing gear is good enough. Isn't settling for good enough a recipe for catastrophic mediocrity in high-stakes fields?
It is a totally rational fear, but the data tells a completely counterintuitive story. In the workplace, a massive meta-analysis was conducted looking at the correlation between perfectionism and actual performance across various fields. The correlation was exactly zero.
Zero.
Perfectionists perform no better than their peers, and frequently they actually perform worse.
Worse? How is that even possible?
Because perfectionists are deeply risk-averse. They avoid unfamiliar challenges, complex surgeries, or experimental engineering designs that might lead to failure. They play it safe to maintain their flawless success rate. But the real world is ambiguous and requires adaptation.
So they never innovate.
Right. And here is the ultimate psychological kicker that perfectionists miss. People judge you by your peaks, not your mistakes. It's called the overblown implications effect. We have this egocentric bias where we think one single mistake will define our entire reputation. But think about William Shakespeare.
The ultimate peak of literature.
Right. We universally revere his genius based on his peaks. Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear. We completely ignore his terrible, messy, forgotten plays like Timon of Athens or Cymbeline.
I haven't even heard of those.
Exactly. He wrote a lot of mediocrity. But history judges you by your best moments, not the messy, flawed, wabi-sabi steps it took to get there.
That is incredibly freeing to realize. Perfectionists get stuck on the diving board, obsessing over an imaginary peak rather than accumulating the messy, splashed-filled jumps required for the climb. It is the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.
And as you take those messy steps and you inevitably fail, you are going to hit massive walls. You are going to fall into deep ruts. Which brings us to the profound reality that absolutely nobody climbs alone.
I want to take us to the winter of 2012, to one of the most hostile environments on Earth, the bitter, freezing summit of Mount Kilimanjaro.
Okay, quite the shift in scenery.
Standing there in the thin air, battling altitude sickness, is R.A. Dickey. He is a professional baseball pitcher, but his career is essentially dead. He's been bouncing around the minor leagues, his traditional pitching mechanics have failed him, and he is lost.
So what's he doing on a mountain?
He climbed it for charity, but standing up there, feeling incredibly small against this immense, brutal landscape, something clicks. This grueling detour, this massive geographical loop backward away from baseball, completely resets his mental framework.
And what happens when he comes down?
He completely abandons his old pitching style. He reinvents himself as a knuckleball pitcher, which is incredibly erratic and hard to master, and goes on to win the Cy Young Award as the best pitcher in the league.
What R.A. Dickey's story beautifully illustrates is that progress is rarely a linear upward trajectory. It is full of loops, regressions, and detours. And when you hit a rut, when your standard mechanics fail you, you need what developmental psychologists call scaffolding.
Like in construction.
Exactly. In construction, scaffolding is a temporary support structure that is bolted onto a building. It allows a crew to reach heights they absolutely couldn't reach alone. And once the building is strong enough to support itself, scaffolding is removed.
So how does that apply to human development?
Scaffolding is temporary support from others. Mentors, peers, systems that allows your latent, hidden potential to surface.
The most moving historical example of this is the Golden 13. It's 1944, right in the middle of World War II, at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station.
I love this story.
The U.S. Navy has finally, reluctantly allowed black men to train to become officers. These 13 men are the first. And the systemic pressure on them is astronomical. The systemic racism of the era literally expected them to fail, and the Navy basically designed the curriculum to wash them out.
Setting them up to fail.
When they hit the incredibly complex navigation modules, like learning to use a sextant to navigate by the stars, they struggled. But they didn't just passively wait for a white instructor to save them, because they knew that wasn't going to happen. They built scaffolding for each other.
How do they do it?
At night, they covered the windows of their barracks so the guards wouldn't see the lights, and they taught each other the material.
And this reveals a profound cognitive mechanism known as the coach effect. We intuitively assume that when we are struggling with a complex problem, we need to receive advice. But neurological studies show that giving advice to someone else actually builds your own confidence and competence more than receiving advice does.
Just like rubber ducking in software engineering.
Rubber ducky.
Yeah. When a programmer is stuck in a bug, they are taught to explain the code line by line to a literal rubber duck on their desk. The act of externalizing and teaching the problem forces the brain to reorganize the information, and they usually spot the error themselves.
That is the exact mechanism. When the Golden 13 taught each other how to use the sextant, they were forcing their own brains to synthesize the knowledge, reinforcing their neural pathways, and reminding themselves that they possessed the tools to succeed. They lifted the entire group.
Every single one of them passed with higher marks than the white candidates.
Which is just incredible.
Okay, but let's look at this practically today. If I am stuck on a really hard problem at work, say a complex financial model, shouldn't I just go to the world's absolute top expert in my company? Why would I rely on my peers who are also struggling? Doesn't the chief financial officer know more about modeling than my study group?
They absolutely know more, but that is exactly why they are often the worst person to teach you.
Why?
This introduces us to a psychological phenomenon called the curse of knowledge. The world's top experts possess deep, tacit knowledge. They have been doing the task so long and at such a high level that their brain runs it on complete autopilot. They have literally forgotten what it feels like to not know the basics.
Oh, man. It's like asking that elite Olympic diver we talked about earlier how to execute a quadruple flip, and he just shrugs and says, I don't know, you just jump and go up in a ball.
Exactly, just go up in a ball. It's entirely useless advice to a beginner because the expert cannot cognitively deconstruct the micro steps anymore. It's too intuitive. That is why peer scaffolding is often far more effective. A peer who just figured out the financial model yesterday remembers the exact frustrating stumbling block you are facing right now.
They remember the friction. Scaffolding is the architecture that connects the starting line to the finish line. It is the structure of the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.
But this brings us to the hardest, most sobering reality of this entire discussion. We have to acknowledge that not everyone gets access to the same scaffolding, and that forces us to look at the macro level of the systems we build.
Let's set our final and perhaps most frustrating scene. It is 1996. A man named Jose Hernandez is sitting at his table holding a letter. It is a rejection letter. from the NASA astronaut candidate program. But it's not his first. It is his 11th rejection letter.
11.
11 times over more than a decade, he has applied to his ultimate dream, and 11 times a system has told him he simply isn't good enough. He crumples the letter up, throws it at the garbage can, misses, and just leaves it on the floor. His spirit is absolutely fundamentally broken.
This is where we must examine the systems that govern our lives. How we build our systems, our public schools, our corporate hiring algorithms, our university admissions dictates whose potential is ever seen in the first place.
Right.
When the NASA selection committee looked at Jose's application, they used a very specific traditional ruler. They looked for the typical astronaut pedigree, elite, military test pilots, Ivy League engineering darlings.
They were looking for a high starting peak. But what did their ruler completely miss?
Their system had absolutely no metric to measure his trajectory. They didn't have a box on the application form that captured the fact that Jose was a migrant farm worker who spent his entire childhood moving from crop to crop across California.
Wow.
They didn't know he didn't learn to speak English fluently until he was 12 years old. They judged his starting point, the altitude of his current resume, and completely ignored the astonishing, impossibly steep trajectory he had climbed just to get that application in the mail.
This connects perfectly to another massive data set from Raj Chetty, the economist we mentioned earlier. He conducted a sweeping study cross-referencing over 1 million tax returns with U.S. patent records. He wanted to see who actually becomes an inventor in America.
And the data was brutally clear on this.
Brutally clear. Kids raised in the top 1% of family income are 10 times more likely to become patent-holding inventors than kids raised below the median income.
And we have to stop and ask ourselves the uncomfortable question. Are rich kids biologically inherently 10 times smarter? Are they 10 times more naturally creative?
Absolutely not. Talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. The system just aggressively filtered out the lower-income kids before they could ever surface. They didn't have the scaffolding. They didn't have the experienced kindergarten teachers teaching them proactivity. They didn't have the financial leeway to be a creature of discomfort and make 200 mistakes a day, because when you are poor, one mistake can mean eviction.
We have to look at countries that build better systems.
Yeah.
Look at Finland. In the United States and Germany, we heavily track students. We test them at age 8 or 9, label them gifted or average, and put them on separate tracks. We solidify their trajectory based on their starting point.
Which is wild for an 8-year-old.
Finland refuses to do this. They have untracked schools. They keep all students together, regardless of early ability, until they are 16 years old. They provide massive, integrated scaffolding for the late bloomers. And as a result, Finland consistently ranks at the very top of global education metrics. They don't filter people out too early.
I have to hit pause here, though.
Okay, what's up?
Because if I am listening to us right now, I might be thinking, this sounds a little too perfectly wrapped. I have to raise a really honest disagreement with the underlying premise of this whole deep dive.
Go ahead.
We have spent the last hour celebrating the raging Rooks from Harlem. We celebrated Melody Hobson rising from evictions to CEO. We celebrated Jose Hernandez eventually getting to space. We've been pushing this incredibly optimistic, almost Hollywood narrative that if you just develop character skills, if you just become proactive, disciplined, and sponge-like, you can overcome anything.
Right.
But isn't this narrative borderline toxic? Aren't we just relying on massive survivorship bias? We are pointing to the one remarkable rose that somehow grew from the concrete, and we are completely ignoring the million seeds that died because they were starved of water.
I agree with you completely, and this is the most vital, necessary counterpoint to everything we've discussed today. The optimism in Adam Grant's work can inadvertently flatten the reality of hard structural barriers if we aren't careful. Expecting marginalized people to possess superhuman character skills just to reach the exact same starting line that a privileged person was born on is a profound failure of our systems.
Yes. If a corporate system requires you to be an absolute superhero just to get an entry-level interview, the system is fundamentally broken.
Exactly. Oppression and poverty absolutely amplify the need for immense character skills, but the phrase, "you have hidden potential," should never be weaponized. It shouldn't become a toxic pressure to perform without support. We cannot use character skills as an excuse to ignore systemic inequality.
We can't just tell people to sponge harder.
Right. Good systems open doors for people who don't grow up with means. They actively shatter glass ceilings. We need systems in our universities and our corporate HR departments that measure rise over run, systems that evaluate the steepness of the slope a candidate climbed, not just the absolute altitude they reached by age 22.
Did NASA ever fix their system?
They did. They eventually broadened their criteria. They finally saw Jose's trajectory and he went to space. But we have to ask ourselves, how many Joses are we throwing in the garbage right now because our rulers are broken?
So what does this all mean for us today? Let's synthesize this incredible journey we've been on.
Yeah.
We have to completely stop looking at people and looking at ourselves and asking the static question, how talented is this person? That is the wrong question, measured with the wrong ruler at the wrong time.
Instead, we must start asking the dynamic question, how far could they travel and what scaffolding are we failing to build for them?
We have to become creatures of discomfort, actively seeking the friction of growth. We have to become proactive sponges, filtering for advice, not feedback. We have to practice wabi-sabi, knowing which flaws to accept so we can actually leap off the dieting board.
And more than anything, we have to build systems that recognize that talent is not a starting point.
I love that. So, do you have a final thought to send everyone out on?
I do. I want to leave you with a final provocative challenge. Think about your workplace tomorrow morning. Think about your family or your local community. Who is the uncut gem sitting right next to you that you have completely written off because they didn't shine on day one, because they didn't have a high y-intercept?
Wow.
The most valuable hidden potential in the world isn't locked in some mythical born child prodigy. The most valuable potential is the ordinary people around you that your own bad rulers keep invisible.
Look for the climb, not just the summit. Remember, you always have to measure the distance traveled, not the height of the peak.